What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 13 DFS MVP. I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com. As always, with my co-host, Matt Savoca. If you are new to the show, every week we go over our favorite values on the FanDuel and the DraftKings main slate, and then bring you a theory segment ranging from the macro to the micro, trying to make you a better overall DFS player. This week, we're going to be talking about interpreting pace and plays. Before we get into that today, make sure you're checking out our other DFS MVP shows every Monday. Matt and I do a cash game review here on YouTube at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Every Saturday, Yahoo DFS Values with Yahoo's Matt Harmon. That is on the podcast feed on Saturdays, both DFS MVP and the Yahoo Fantasy Football podcast feed. And every Sunday morning, the DFS GPP Last Look show with Jordan Vanek on the subscriber-only Discord channel. That's Sunday, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. If you are not signed up, click in the description below to get signed up for the 4for4 Discord. And if you don't have access to that yet, the price is down to $24 for the rest of the season for the 4for4 DFS package. And if you sign up and use the code DFSMVP, you could get an additional 10% off. We go through the Super Bowl, so still plenty of time left to get value on that. And today's show is brought to you by WynnBet. WynnBet is bringing the excitement of Wynn Las Vegas to online sports betting. Get in on all of your favorite teams, players, and sports, from boosted parlays to live in-game odds on every major sport. We have what you need to win. Sign up today to receive a special offer, a risk-free $1,000 sports bet. Download the WynnBet app now. Use the promo code 4for4. That's the number 4, F-O-R, the number 4, to claim your risk-free bet. Matt, welcome to week 13.
Hey, thrilled to be here, TJ.
Yeah,
also,
man.
gotta say, the $24 DFS pass and even under $22 if you add that DFS MVP, that is a steal. So if you haven't gotten on that at this point, this is a great time of year. Still tons of content. Excited to dig into this. Again, kind of a weird slate, not a lot of high totals. And I will say something right off the bat. This is where the 4for4 value metric is one of the best single numbers that you can look at for fantasy football, because it actually helps in not just player selection, but game selection. You're going to see us highlighting certain games in our value picks throughout the show.
Yeah, we have one really big note on that today. It really helps with salary allocation, trying to figure out who to pay up for, what chalk to pay up for. So that helps a ton. So let's just jump right into it. And we both have a game that we like a ton. There's a lot of value in this game. Which quarterback are you looking at this week?
Yeah, I'm going to go right to Derek Carr. So right now, that Vegas Raiders versus Washington game is sitting at a 49.5 point total. It's fluctuated with the second or the third highest total game right now. It's actually sitting at the second right now, above Los Angeles versus Cincinnati. And I think this is a situation where you have two offenses that, even if one of the big playmakers in Darren Waller is out, you have enough capability, enough firepower where they can both win games with their offensive alone. I mean, Derek Carr is first in the NFL in passing yards, and the defenses on both sides, again, are bad enough that they can shoot themselves in the foot to the point where both of these teams are going to score plenty of points. So I'm looking at Derek Carr at 7,500 on FanDuel, 6,000 on DraftKings. I think with 8.3 yards per attempt this year, even on that massive volume that we've seen, I'm impressed with the efficiency of Derek Carr. He's top 5 in attempts and in deep attempts and in air yards, but he's remained efficient nonetheless. 7.6 adjusted yards per attempt is QB8 this year, and he has gotten help from his receivers. One thing I noticed is that in average separation at time of target, which just how open his receivers are, they're actually number 1 in the NFL. That certainly helps a player like Carr, who tends to have trouble throwing players open, if you will. And the matchup is stellar. Washington is 30th in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses, dead last against quarterbacks, and Las Vegas in game script adjusted rush rate. They're middle of the road, so they're looking to pass more than a lot of teams here. Tons of shootout potential, decent offenses, 2 bad defenses. This is the kind of game environment I'm targeting, especially when it's at that third highest Vegas total like it has been this week.
Yeah, the values in this game are very abundant, and we'll be using a ton of them in cash games. That's going to lead to a lot of GPP implications, which we'll get deeper into on the GPP show on Sunday morning. But there are going to be a ton of very popular players on this game. One thing to note about Derek Carr is that in addition to Darren Waller being out or likely out, doubtful, Josh Jacobs was a late week add to the injury report. He's questionable, so if he doesn't go, Raiders can really ramp up the passing volume. That's already the way to attack Washington, so something to keep an eye on there, because they can really end up throwing a ton of balls this week. And like you said, Derek Carr leading the league in yards per game, has a handful of games over that 300-yard bonus mark, so liking him. And I'm just going to stay in this game on the other side. Taylor Heineke, 7,100 FanDuel, 5,600 on DraftKings. You mentioned the game fluctuating like around 50 points. If you consider it a 50-point game, which I think it'll probably settle at, of the three games with an over-under of at least 50, this is the smallest spread. So like you said, there is a lot of shootout potential here. Both defenses ranked in the bottom 10 in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. And we'll talk about Gibson a lot later, but from a passing perspective, I like Heineke in this passing game for a couple reasons. Obviously the value, but when we're just trying to figure out how this game can play out, we're going to see a very concentrated target share with Logan Thomas back. We saw him and Terry McLaurin combined for about 40% of the targets last week with 80% of the air yards. Then DeAndre Carter was in the mix with a 15% target share and 25% of the air yards. So he has the players that he really wants to throw it to. Heineke does, and that helps an offense a lot, just really being able to dial in on your best players. The Raiders have allowed 20 plus FanDuel points, 24 plus DraftKings points against 4 of the last 6 quarterbacks that they faced. And Heineke does give you a little bit of a boost that Carr doesn't give you on the ground, averaging about 25 yards per game on the ground. And on top of that, since week 8, Washington is near the top of the league in plays run. We're going to talk about that a lot in the theory segment, but that is something that we're looking to, and they've been trending up in that category. So I think there's lots of value in the Washington passing game, but you like the running game as well.
Yep, we do. And again, we're sticking right here. We're sticking to the fundamentals of DFS too. Yep. Strong game environment, 2 defenses that can both be exploited, and offenses that remain concentrated even with injuries. So we're gonna use the value metric to our advantage and say that Antonio Gibson, especially with JD McKissic trending towards out here, is nearing must-start, a must-start tier in terms of our value ranking. Usually 10.0 is that number in our value metric, where basically you have to be doing something strategic to not have this player on your roster. So Gibson is certainly there. It was great to see when McKissic got hurt that target share went to no one else, but I'll see in chat that McKissic is already ruled out officially. Thank you, chat there. We saw a bunch of target share go to Antonio Gibson in a way that we've been waiting for this player, because it was basically the thing holding him back from workhorse back status. We're seeing Gibson's usage really change even before the injury, though. Since the week 9 bye, Gibson had 26 opportunities in week 10 before 19 in week 11, then gets 36 opportunities, including 7 targets against Seattle. That's fantastic. Again, Las Vegas is 30th in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, so they're equally bad against the run as they are the pass. McKissick's 14% target share was kind of that thing that was in the way of Gibson, and now if that's gone, I know they're saying that Wendell Smallwood might play the McKissic role. That feels a little coach speaky to me. Washington is already 6th in the NFL in game script adjusted rush rate. So even when you contextualize for the game environment that they're in, they're still leaning on the rush. I like their concentrated pass attack as well, but I think Gibson is just has too much opportunity coming his way in a good matchup to ignore.
Yeah, and even with with McKissick getting a pretty big chunk of touches last week, we still saw Gibson get 36 touches against Seattle. Now, that was very inflated. It was the most cumulative running back touches a team has had in a game this year. But the point is that even if another running back is somewhat involved, Gibson's going to get his. Right now on the main slate, there are 4 players that have at least 16 touches in every game over the last month: Jonathan Taylor, Antonio Gibson, Joe Mixon, Leonard Fournette, and you're getting Gibson at a huge discount compared to those guys. So he's one of the no-brainer values on the slate. He will be probably the most popular player, maybe on all 3 sites if we include Yahoo. I think Alexander Madison is cheaper on Yahoo, so down there. But Gibson could easily be the most popular player on both sites this week. So make sure you're taking that into consideration if you are building GPP lineups. And you mentioned the value metric on 4 for 4. Gibson, one of the only players over 10. There's only 2 players over 10 on DraftKings. The other one is Elijah Mitchell at $7,600 on FanDuel, $6,000 on DraftKings, facing that very team that Gibson had 36 touches against last week in Seattle. The 49ers favored by 3 points. We have seen 5 different instances of a team give their running backs 35 total touches against Seattle. There's only been 2 instances where a team has given their running backs 40 total touches. Both of those games came against Seattle, and Mitchell's accounting for 75% of the 49ers backfield touches in full games that he's played this year. So if they come anywhere close to that 35 touch number, Mitchell obviously in for a huge day. Already has 27 plus touches in 2 of his last 3 games. He's not going to be losing those vulture touchdown rushes to Deebo Samuel. I don't think they're just going to magically, I don't think they're going to magically have Ayuk running those plays, even though Ayuk is a good play in his own right. And in addition to all those touches, the points have been there against Seattle. 6 running backs have scored at least 20 fantasy points against Seattle. 9 have gone over 15. Those numbers bump up even higher if we look at it from a PPR standpoint. So Mitchell is a smash for me. It's just a really interesting week with running backs, and I'm going to get into this a little bit with my wide receiver talk actually, but we have Mitchell, Gibson, Jamal Williams, Alexander Madison. I'm forgetting another one, but we have like 5 guys that are
so
crazy.
many. Yeah, James Conner, Darrell Henderson. They're all in decent
Henderson's
spot.
one I was thinking of, and Conner. So like there isn't a lot of separation between these guys this week in terms of projection. So I think the way to play it is in cash games, especially on DraftKings, but also on FanDuel, like just take the value from salary because they're all projecting really similarly, even though I do think like Madison's my favorite to smash. And then in tournaments, like just consider the ownership. Like you're not losing much in terms of projection where like you could get a 12% guy this week that's going to have kind of the same ceiling as a 25% guy. So it's a really interesting puzzle to solve specifically at the running back position this week.
Yeah, I completely agree. Did you notice that the San Francisco 49ers are giving Mitchell like the star injury designation treatment? Like he has not injury related rest as DNPs for Wednesday and Thursday. That's usually reserved for players that they cannot afford to lose. Yeah, so I just think that solidifies my confidence in Mitchell as well.
He's getting the Kawhi Leonard treatment. I like it. We don't see it in the NFL often.
Load management. That's right.
Yeah. Moving on to wide receivers and going back to our favorite game of the week. You like the primary pass catcher on the Raiders.
Yeah, you got to go with Hunter Renfrow here. He's an obvious option with Darren Waller expected to be out. 8+ targets for Hunter Renfrow in 6 of his last 8 games. So you know the floor was there already before Waller goes out. Now you got to assume that there is an even higher floor and certainly a higher target ceiling. Yeah. I would say double-digit target ceiling for sure. Renfrow, regardless of what he looks like, he is an elite separator at the wide receiver position. 2.2 yards of separation at the time of target is wide receiver 4. Excuse me, that's 2.2 yards on average at time of target. That's leading to a top 24 QBR when he's targeted. He is open and he's efficient when he's targeted. Those are great things for a quarterback, and it's a big reason why Derek Carr has ultimately been leading the league in passing so far this season. Carr's going to need a low average depth of target hog in this offense with Waller out. Yeah. And there's obviously a debate. We're going to get into who that could be later on. And genuinely, the matchup is good enough here against Washington where I wouldn't be surprised if it's both Renfrow and someone like Foster Moreau getting there. But if we are picking a low average depth of target player, we need red zone upside because they don't have good per play upside. And that's exactly what we get with Renfrow. He's wide receiver 14 this year in total red zone targets and has a healthy but I think sustainable 6.1% touchdowns per target rate. That's 25th among wide receivers. So we're not expecting that to change ultimately all that much going forward here. I think this is pretty simple. He's already playing well. It's a great matchup. The target floor is extremely high and the value is there, especially on DraftKings under 6K. I think that's a really strong play.
Yeah, and I think the way they're, even though Washington is they have really struggled against the deep ball, Deshaun is a little banged up, and he still only saw 4 targets last week, and his big play actually came on a crossing route. His average depth of target was like, it's been since over the last 2 weeks 13.3, which is high, definitely on the high end, but not what we're used to seeing from Deshaun, like in that 16 to 17 yard range. So
no revenge game narrative?
I know,
for Deshaun.
Well, I mean, he's like Adrian Peterson. He has a revenge game against like almost every team at this point. Like, right? What are you doing? Like 5 teams. There's only so many. But my point is, I think the Raiders actually do attack Washington a little bit more methodically than maybe some other teams have. I mean, Bryan Edwards hasn't even been running a ton of deep routes. Zay Jones is running routes but not getting a ton of targets. So I actually think it is just a ton of Renfrow. And I mean, from that perspective, it could slow the game down on one of the two sides, but the over-under is still really high. And Renfrow, you don't think about him as like an upside guy because he is like a low average depth of target guy, but if they are moving the ball methodically, he's going to get end zone or red zone targets. And compared to his salary, I think that his ceiling is plenty fine.
Yeah. I think he's just a smash value this week.
Yeah, a going back to your point earlier in the podcast about our value scores and using them to really determine how we not just pick our players each position, but how we pick our players across positions. And it's the reason that I wanted to specifically hone in on Cooper Kupp, who's $9,000 on both sites this week against the Jaguars, the Rams being one of the only two teams with an implied point total over 30 points. And usually, we always hone in on our favorite values here. That doesn't always mean the cheapest plays. A lot of times it is. But this week, I think it's really important to highlight Cooper Kupp in a slate where there's no Debo, no Tyreek, no Devontae. You could even throw Steph Diggs in there if you want to, as like that elite tier of wide receivers. But if we go to that value score on both sides, Cooper Kupp has a value score about 50% higher than any other wide receiver on the slate. If we look at all the other positions, the gaps between the number 1 and the number 2 in terms of value scores, like maybe 1 full point, and from a percentage perspective, just like really small, like maybe 10 or 15%. Kupp's the only wide receiver with a 20-point projection on either site. It's around 25 on DraftKings. So there's only one other receiver projected for 15 on FanDuel, only one projected for 19, none other cracking 20 on DK. So he's like a 25% to 33% projection above the field. Odell possibly out or limited. There's a ton of affordable running backs on the slate. So you could, like we talked about with the running backs, like you can get a discount on ownership at running back, not have to pay a different salary tier, and still be, it's same with quarterback too, get the same projection from those guys with the value. Whereas with Kupp, if you're paying down, you're not getting the same ceiling projection. Like his projection relative to the field, his value score relative to the field is just lapping everybody. And we've seen him in insane smash slate breaking spots this season. So when people are like, when do I eat the chalk? When do I pay up for players? When do I pay up for an expensive player that is chalky? Like these are the spots. I don't care if Odell's out. If Cooper Kupp, if he gets like a 40% ownership projection, maybe we think about it. I don't think that's going to happen. I think at the most tomorrow, if we get news that Odell is going to be out, like I think he maybe gets bumped up to like maybe 32%ish on either side, but his salary is still pretty high. And I think what a lot of people are going to do is see these value running backs and try to get in these higher priced quarterbacks, and a couple be involved some too. But the point is, like, these are the spots where I'm willing to eat the chalk on an expensive player. He's just like, he's in such a smash spot and just such a upgrade over the field. We just don't see it. We don't see it this obvious very often.
Yeah, and even if his ownership gets up to that 32% or so, I bet if you ran an optimizer and you spit out, let's say, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 lineup, I bet Cooper Kupp is showing up in that optimal lineup more than a third of the time. So his leverage against the field is still positive, in my opinion, especially with the way this slate breaks down with so many value running backs. I can just move away from the chalk running backs while staying put on this Ram stack, which of course is going to include Cooper Kupp. So yeah, I'm glad you highlighted him. He is just far ahead of the field right now. I mean, you can make a case for Justin Jefferson, but that's really about it.
Yeah, and I mean, we just don't see a. I mean, obviously Jefferson has slate breaking ability, but like we've seen Kupp put up multiple 40 spots, and just even like, we don't want to live on projections. Obviously, they are very fragile, but we just don't get gaps like this. Like, the only time we really ever see gaps like this is when it's Kelsey versus a weak tight end field, like when like Waller and Andrews and Kittle are all off the slate. It's very rare that we get these situations, so I think we should take advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go right into my next player here, but I do want to say we're not talking about a situation where this one wide receiver has like a 5.0 in our value ranking and the rest of the field has like a 1. So they're not priorities overall. This is a 9.0 or higher player approaching absolute must start, while the rest of the field is ho-hum, at least in our metric. A player who I don't think is very ho-hum anymore is Darnell Mooney. I mean, he's gotten more opportunities, obviously, with Allen Robinson out of the lineup, looking like that is trending that way again this week. We know Andy Dalton is in, and I think that's a little bit of a boost for Darnell Mooney, just to get some stability at the position, if anything else. Since week 9, only 6 wide receivers are averaging 10 or more targets per game. One of them is Darnell Mooney. He's the wide receiver 2 in average target share during that span, and he hasn't had less than a 20% target share in any of the team's games since week 9. So he's really just turned it on in this second half of the year. Arizona is not an incredible matchup for Chicago. Honestly, what is a great matchup for Chicago offense? But Arizona is moving closer to league average in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed than they were previously this season. You know, that's something, that negative trend is something I want to pay attention to, not lean on entirely, but it's something I notice. And again, with Robinson out, I feel confident that that target share floor should really be there. So it's a similar argument that I made in last week's show with Deontay Johnson, who's still consistently getting a dozen or more targets in every game. If this team had higher implied totals and there was more touchdown upside for Darnell Mooney on a week-to-week basis, there's absolutely no way we would get him at this salary, $5,600 on DraftKings, $6,700 on FanDuel. This is, as we said, an area of the wide receiver pool where you don't have to get there, but if you are in this middle tier, this is my favorite. Darnell Mooney, I like a lot this week.
Yeah, and the again, going back to all the value running backs, it lets you build really on both sides, like a Kupp and then still a bunch of value wide receivers in this mid-tier range. Like, we don't have any smash punt plays at running back or wide receiver, which is usually where we look for them, but we don't really need them because we have so many running backs that are affordable. I mean, Mooney he's a guy that some people might look at things like catch rate, which I don't think are important, and see like a low one on Mooney, but he is so efficient with the targets that he does catch. He has so many big play targets, but still has enough volume in the intermediate range where he's fairly consistent. If we look at something like 4for4's article, Hopping to Conclusions, Sam Hoppin's article, we see Mooney near the top. Like in any weighted opportunity or air yards rating, anything you look at, Mooney's near the top since week 8. So the usage is just is through the roof there. He's probably my favorite, considering the fact that there are so many Raiders and Washington players that are values. Darnell Mooney's probably my favorite value wide receiver, even over Hunter Renfrow, even though in a vacuum, Renfrow probably grades out a little bit better.
And also just the lone bright spot in what has been a putrid
Yeah.
passing offensive season for the Chicago Bears. They need something. Cole Kmet ain't it, at least yet.
Not yet, not yet. A guy that hasn't been it lately is Michael Pittman at 6,800 on FanDuel, 5,700 on DraftKings, but we do expect him to have a bounce back against Houston in a game where Indianapolis is favored by 10 with the third highest implied point total on the slate. And I think that with the Buccaneers, with the Rams, and then with some other offenses like the Raiders and Washington grabbing a lot of focus, that the Colts are going to be the team. With Pittman struggling recently, with Jonathan Taylor priced astronomically, people are just going to be like, yeah, their projection is high, but I just don't really want to get to them. I think Pittman is the way to secure a lot of those points for a really good value. And because he struggled the last two games, might not even be that popular in cash games, let alone GPPs, but he does really pop in our wide receiver breakout model this week after having two games with fewer than 10 PPR points, but he's still top 20 in expected fantasy points over the last 3 weeks. Not near the top of the league like he was earlier in the season, but still high enough where the range of outcomes and the ceiling still is really there, especially against Houston. I mentioned the Colts should score a lot of points against this defense. You can attack them kind of any which way. They actually haven't given up a ton of fantasy points to running backs. Like, running backs have been very good against them, but they haven't had these explosion games against them, which you would think against such a bad team they would. Only two running backs have went over 20 fantasy points against Houston, and that's because teams have been able to attack them so effectively through the air, and not just methodically, but on really quick hitters. They've allowed the second most PPR points per target on balls of 20 plus air yards. And Michael Pittman doesn't run a ton of deep routes, but he runs enough where he could take advantage of that against Houston.
Yeah, I saw the same thing. If you just look at yards allowed per pass attempt, Houston is bottom 10 in the NFL, and points allowed per play, same exact thing. This is a smash spot for the Colts, and I think people might be overlooking it.
Yeah, I think they'll definitely overlook it. Let's move on to tight end, and a very interesting game because I do think there is many stacking potential in this game, and I like a couple of receivers, but you like one of the tight ends.
Yeah, I like this skinny stack too, or maybe something with like Lamar Jackson and this player, Pat Freiermuth. Yeah. Really excited to see him practicing in full. Looks like he is going to play after, I think he was in the concussion protocol. And I know if you look at our value metric, there might be a sort of obvious answer that you won't hear in George Kittle, but I picked him last week and he only had 2 targets. And now the way that fantasy football works, he'll have 10 targets and 2 touchdowns. Yeah. But ultimately, I didn't pick him. Claypool is still dealing with toe injuries in that receiving core. And I was really excited to see Freiermuth have a 78% snap share, which was second, and just the second time over 75% this season. Actually, it was his highest snap share this season, not second highest. And his 28 routes run was also a season high. That's what we're going to see with Eric Ebron out. He's got 5 TDs in his last 5 games. Obviously, he's living on the touchdown a little bit, but that's less concerning because we're seeing the usage continue to creep up. Baltimore is now above average in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed. That's harder for opposing defenses, but they're really looking like one of the bigger pass funnels in the NFL right now. 9th in yards per carry allowed this season and 29th in yards per pass attempt allowed. If you just focus on the last 3 weeks, they're second in yards allowed per carry. That's second best in the NFL, and 26th in yards allowed per pass attempt. So if the Steelers are going to keep this competitive, and boy, it didn't look like they could stay competitive with anyone last week, but if they do, they're going to need to lean on players like Pat Freiermuth, especially in the red zone. Deontay Johnson can't catch everything, can't have 20 targets in this game. So I really think that you could go to Pat Freiermuth as a solid value in the mid-tier of tight ends.
Yeah, I like that game a lot. You mentioned Baltimore being a pass funnel, also running a ton of plays themselves. They're a team that could they can drag an opponent up with them because they run so many plays, but also struggle against the pass. So teams don't necessarily have to run 70 plays to have success against Baltimore. So I like that game a lot, and I have to go with the layup here, even though we've talked about this game a ton already. Foster Moreau, $5,000 on FanDuel, $2,700 on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I mean, he'll be as popular in cash games as in DraftKings, maybe a little bit less, but not much. I don't think you necessarily have to use him because it's pretty easy to get up to like a Kittle on FanDuel, and I think that's probably a fine play. On DraftKings, it is just an absolute must in cash games. There isn't another tight end even close to his salary that's worth consideration in cash. You're opening up a ton elsewhere. He saw 6 for 60 and a touchdown on 6 targets the last time Waller missed a game. We already mentioned Jacobs being a surprise pop-up on the injury report, and that could lead the Raiders to throwing more than expected. And we also discussed with Renfrow how they can attack this Washington team with Deshaun limited, with their other receivers not really doing it in the deep game. They've really struggled in that aspect of their offense since Henry Ruggs was released from the team. So I think you pretty much have to use Foster Moreau and DK Cash. I mean, there's a chance he ends up in like 80% of cash game lineups if you're in a large field double up, maybe even more. So even if he is a dud in cash games, you're just not going to lose any ground to the field. And especially at that salary, it's just a complete no-brainer. He's the only tight end I wrote up for my cash game options. I will say in GPPs, which of course we're just talking about values, but I think it's worth noting because he is going to be so insanely popular, like might even be more popular than the running backs, at least on DraftKings. I think the way to approach a player like this is use him in Derek Carr stacks, because if you're going to eat that much ownership, you might as well get like an exponential return if he does hit, right? Like, what's the point of just getting his 15 or 20 DraftKings points if 40% of the field gets that too? Like, you might as well hope that he hits with Derek Carr and maybe another player in the Raiders offense and get that cascading effect with Carr if he blows up. So I think that's the way I'm approaching it. If I'm playing Foster Moreau in GPPs, it's in Carr stacks.
Totally agree. He's not the kind of player that I want to play in GPPs, I'll say, as that one-off chalk play after I've gotten contrarian in other parts of my lineup. That's not the way I want to go with the chalk in tournaments. So
exactly,
I completely agree.
Let's hit on our favorite defenses of the week. And ironically, you're going back to the game we've been talking about the whole time with our favorite values.
Hey, this is a great time to remind people about range of outcomes, and I'm sure we've talked about it on some of the recent game theory segments. You can check out that playlist on the 4for4 YouTube channel. But remember, just because the Raiders are in a good spot, and just because this looks like a sneaky or not so sneaky shootout with the way this Vegas total keeps creeping up, does not mean when there's lots of passing and there's two teams that aren't so great offensively that it can't lead to a bunch of sacks and a bunch of turnovers and just a bunch of sloppy football in general. So I really like the fact that that we have all these offensive values, but Washington's defense cleverly in our value metric is creeping up into the top tier on both DraftKings and FanDuel because they still have a top 5 pass rush grade via PFF. Yes, I know Chase Young is out for the year, but they still have playmakers on that defensive line despite that 30th ranked schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed. You know the negative script for Derek Carr. He's pressured consistently. He gets off his spot. He throws inaccurately, and he's turning the ball over multiple times. We've seen it before. And so if they can eliminate chunk plays, which part of the work has been done for them with Darren Waller being out in this game most likely, they might be able to shut down this team. And now Josh Jacobs is questionable in this as well. So when I see a high value score in a high pace and a high total game, it means that we're likely banking on turnovers here. I think the Washington defense, despite an up and down year, could pull it off here.
Yeah, it's probably pretty tough to play Washington in your cash games on DraftKings just because you can't play a lineup without Foster Moreau on DK and cash. On FanDuel, we mentioned like it's not that hard to get up to Kittle or I mean, even like, I don't know if you could get up. I think is Gronk more expensive on FanDuel? I'm not sure. But the point is, like, it's not that hard to have a lineup in cash on FanDuel that doesn't include Renfrow or Moreau. Like, they're not such smashes that you have to do that. So I think if you do find yourself in a spot like that, especially where you want to pay up for a tight end, it's pretty easy to just slide in Washington at that salary on FanDuel.
Yeah, especially it's an afternoon game. If you got to get weird because your 1 o'clocks were disastrous, then you can throw caution to the wind and play it But otherwise, yeah, you're
that's a
probably
good point
not
too.
on DraftKings.
That's a really good point too. If you're late swapping, have that in your back pocket's a really good idea. This defense will probably be the most popular on the slate now that Mike Glennon is starting. The line actually moved from 4 to 6 in favor of the Dolphins when it was officially announced that Daniel Jones was out. The Dolphins are $4,000 on FanDuel, $3,300 on DraftKings. They're projected to allow. It was 18. I think it's down to 17 points now. Over the last 6 weeks, the Dolphins lead the league in pressure rate, according to Sports Info Solutions, and that will be against Mike Glennon behind that offensive line that has really been struggling this year. So Dolphins are a slam dunk value play, relatively easy to get to. 4,400 FanDuel, 3,300 DraftKings is kind of expensive on DraftKings, but with all the values we've discussed so far today, they should be pretty easy to slide into your cash lineups.
Yeah, and I think at least when I was looking at the DK values, they were the only value above 0 for the defense position. So that makes it pretty easy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Love them there. Before we get into our theory segment today, I want to tell you about the easiest, most fun way to spice up your fantasy football season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their brand new Pick'em game. Just pick over or under on your favorite or least favorite player stats, and you could win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you could take home some cold, hard cash. Head over to 4for4.com/underdog to claim your free 4for4 Pro subscription and get $10 in bonus cash to play on Underdog this weekend. Matt, one thing we talk about a lot, and we actually have an article that's dedicated to this from Sam Hoppen, is pace and plays, and it's something that I've been digging into quite a bit over the last couple of weeks, and we always kind of briefly mention it when we're talking, especially when we're talking about our quarterbacks and games that we're targeting, but it's a topic that I do think is worth diving into specifically because I do think there is not a lot, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about how to use it, and in using plays per game and pace interchangeably, which they aren't. So I want to cover these things, pace and plays per game, a little bit, and just dig into how we use them in terms of selecting games, selecting players, and just in our overall research process. So talk to me a little bit about just how you define pace and plays initially.
Sure. Just defining them. Pace is how fast a team is playing. Usually we're going to come up with some metric that shows the speed at which they get from one play to the next. Very common is seconds per play. That's what we're often seeing these days. And associated with that is plays overall. And what we have to remember is that often is associated with passing because of a very simple fact of football that incomplete passes stop the clock. So you can often create situations where pass-happy offenses compound on themselves over the course of a game, thus creating huge discrepancies in the number of plays in one game versus the other. You know, what we're looking for ultimately is teams that play fast and, as I said, throw more, regardless of the score of the actual game, tend to produce more fantasy points because incomplete passes, again, stop the clock. That equals more plays. Faster pace equals more plays. More plays equals more potential for fantasy points. It really is that simple when we boil it down. But one thing I want to add is I think this is an area that I don't know if we want to say it's a next frontier, but I think it is an area where we haven't really honed our processes. You know, one area you could say that we've gotten a lot better as a community is utilizing average depth of target and air yards, where that was a real edge 5 or 6 years ago. But pace of play and nailing what games have shootout potential, that's a gray area that we're still getting better at. So I think this is a great thing to dig into today.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on some of those nuances, and I think where there might be a couple edges in that interpretation. Again, people just conflating pace with plays and not understanding how they interact with each other and why there could be some kind of counterintuitive takeaways from it. But before we get into that, just harping on your last point about more plays equals more fantasy points, it is intuitive, but sometimes in football, the intuitive things don't always play out that way when we look at the numbers. So there is statistical data that backs up that notion. In terms of league-wide average plays per game, an offense averages about 63 plays per game. When teams have been one standard deviation above that this season, when they've ran 72 or more plays in a game, they've averaged 27 points. The league average points per game is 23. So, almost a 20% increase in points per game or points per team when you add one standard deviation in plays run. So that is very important that we are understanding that we are seeking out these teams that are running a lot of plays, not necessarily games that can have a lot of plays. We'll get into that more. And I do think that's one area where people have a lot of errors. I think we can do a lot better by just looking for a single team that can have more plays, but we'll dig into that more. And that's back to that note. Fast pace doesn't always mean a lot of plays. And again, Sam Hoppen writes our article that really covers pace, plays, breaks it down by play expectation, and then also goes into more granular level, like looking at a recent 5-week trend versus the whole season trend. So people need to be very cognizant about that. Teams can be fast, but not move the ball very effectively, or not move the ball fast and still be worthwhile in terms of getting a lot of plays if they're slow. So there is some discrepancy there, and reading that article every week and understanding how Sam breaks down that nuance is very important. But like to that point, that kind of ties into things like game script and adjusting these numbers, right?
Right. And that really is the next step. And Sam does a great job in that article, just visualizing things for you. Yeah. It is kind of complicated to break all this down. And honestly, we should just be adding layers of depth, not taking them away. So bear with us, because it is really important to game script adjust these pace. And, tied to this concept is passing numbers really as well, because obviously, if you know anything about football, is that teams that are playing from behind are more likely to pass and more likely to have a sense of urgency, thus playing with a faster pace of play. Yeah. So we need to make sure we're contextualizing all of these play numbers and these pace of play numbers for the game environment that teams find themselves in. Because one thing we know is that while efficiency matters most for quarterback in fantasy football, efficiency really matters for all players, because big games come from extreme efficiency typically on a requisite, just a normal amount of volume. So we want to have the ability to seek players who have the possibility of being efficient when the pace of play changes, when things change. And we should use resources that kind of help us get there. We've mentioned Sam's Hop Into Conclusions article, really one of the best ones out there. Football Outsiders was one of the first stat services that were able to offer pace of play stats, seconds per play. And I think they have moved behind a paywall. I did see on Awesemo.com's website, they have an advanced stats tool that has some stats that I've mentioned on this show: game script adjusted rush rate and game script adjusted pace of play. So those are some free resources. I think that Sam's article is right there at the cream of the top, the cream of the crop, is in terms of helping you understand these concepts, which can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, and two things that you mentioned were contextualizing all these numbers and also understanding efficiency versus volume on a team level. And again, I asked Sam about his article specifically and to talk about how to contextualize some of these things. One of the obvious ones is like if we look at something like plays per game, one overtime game can throw things out of whack. So understanding that sometimes we need to strip that out of the math. And again, Sam does that a lot in the article when necessary. And then his takeaway or the thing that he should note to readers is not a lot of times, we need to be looking at the extremes, because from whether it's pace or plays per game, most teams are fitting in this really tight range. Like I mentioned, that 63 plays per game for an offense. I think seconds per play is usually around like 23 or 24 seconds or something like that. And the variation is going to be pretty small on either side. So like just because a team is like, I don't know, let's say they're sixth in plays per game, if that's, like a 0.3 standard deviation above the league average, like that doesn't actually really matter, right? So we need to really be like a team like the Ravens who ran so many plays every game, or a team like the Seahawks barely run any plays. Those are where we should really be paying attention. And again, we're going to get into that shortly, but again, to your point about efficiency, I looked at like how plays and pace and all these things correlate with actual points scored, which is the thing we care about most. Yards per play has a correlation with points scored of 0.62. That is a enormous correlation.
It's huge.
When we're looking at something like just one of these numbers that relates to points, and that makes sense, right? If they're moving the ball a lot, they should score. Whereas if we look at something like plays ran per game versus points for the offense, the correlation is just 0.27. Somewhat significant, worth like looking at, but not a huge significance. If we look at total plays in a game versus total points, just 0.32, looking at both teams combined. So again, pretty close to that, like start to think about it being significant, but nowhere near efficiency. So when I think the takeaway from this specifically is if we're not looking at these outliers in terms of plays per game or pace, and you're asking, should I be paying attention to it? The answer is, if you have a very strong read on an offense's efficiency, you should weight that way more than something like pace or plays per game. And like offenses such as the Packers come to mind.
That's always the one I bring up. Yeah,
they're notorious for being one of the slowest paced teams in the league, which they are, but they actually run a fair amount of plays. They can be very efficient very quickly because of Aaron Rodgers, which is extremely important. And because they are efficient with usually with their passing game, they are a team that can be pushed a little bit. And we talked about them the week that it was the Aaron Rodgers Vikings, like that stack went off. The reason we were pushing them is because if they get a little bit of a nudge with a team that will pace up a little bit or will throw with them, they can play that type of game. So they're not like Seattle, who isn't running a lot of plays or running a slow pace that isn't going to at least Seattle right now, not Seattle historically, but Seattle right now, where they're not going to match up. Like Green Bay, they can overcome that slow pace, and they often do. So again, contextualizing these things, understanding how important like something like an offensive efficiency is, and should really outweigh something like a pace or a plays per game.
As we're talking about it too, and maybe I'll be able to back test this a little bit over the course of the offseason, but one thing we might be able to incorporate as we get even one level deeper here is air yards into this equation, because air yards per second of play could be a good ratio to look at. Again, I haven't back tested it yet, but if you have a team that is slower paced, but when they do pass, they're taking huge shots, like the example we gave, the Packers. Maybe we can find some examples there, but that's for some studies down the road. Personally, I want to add that the pace and plays and mostly passing overall numbers for a game, that is part of my game selection process more so than my player selection process. Not to say that I won't use it at all in the player selection process, but I know that identifying games with more plays, that correlation of 0.32, especially in sports, is nothing to scoff at for total plays versus total points. And while I can't always predict efficiency, if I could, I'd be a millionaire at DFS. I know that if I get more opportunities than my opponents, that's plus EV over time. So I have that same old uncertainty about who benefits from an increase in pace or an increase in passing or an increase in plays overall, but it might help me break a tie. Usually at that point in my player selection process, I am a little bit more focused on the matchup, the way the defense is, the personnel on either side. But obviously, the amount of opportunities one gets is directly related to the amount of opportunities total in a game. So it's unignorably important.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I wanted to bring up this topic is because I have been digging into these numbers, and the main reason we use it, or the main way I use it, is to pick out. I'm really using this on the team level. Like, what teams am I targeting? It's usually trending more towards GPPs. Where can I see some fireworks either on one side of the ball or both side of the ball? I think that I go back to Sam because he's kind of the mastermind on this article at 4for4. His kind of general takeaway from this like game selection and you saying how do I interpret this in terms of picking which team I like. His general knows kind of loose rule of thumb is fast teams tend to pull up slow teams when they're facing each other. Or as I would put it, it's very unlikely that a slow team is going to drag down a fast team. And I do think that maybe it's just my bias because it's been one of my errors even into this season. But I often want to look for two teams that are kind of fast or two teams that are kind of up in plays and think that's going to kind of boost the game. I think the shift might be towards we should just really be leaning more towards those offenses that are on the extreme, not looking for two teams that are ranked kind of high or even necessarily two teams that are ranked high, but find just a couple of offenses. They don't have to be not playing against each other, but just a couple offenses on the week that rank really high in that plays per game metric, and that's where the points are going to come. The reason being, plays per game has a huge inverse relationship with a team's opponent. The plays per game versus the opponent's plays per game, a correlation of negative 0.52. So in general, as a team runs more plays, the opposing team runs less plays, and that's where I think there might be a little bit of a misunderstanding in how we're using these, because I think so many people just want to say, I want two fast teams, I want two teams to run a lot of plays. The problem with that is there's only a finite number of plays in an NFL game. It's a timed game, right? So I went through and looked at this, and in non-overtime games, when teams have run 70 or more plays, or again, like one standard deviation over the average, their opponent has averaged about 55 games or one standard deviation below. So we see that push-pull, that inverse relationship in that example. And when we look at the games that have had some of the most plays run by an offense, those have often come against opponents that average few games per play, below average plays per game, 62 or lower. And again, that kind of makes sense. Think about Washington last week. Seattle doesn't run a lot of plays. If there's a finite number of plays in the game and Seattle's only taking 40 or 50 of them, well, Washington's going to take all those other plays, right? Because going back to pace, there isn't a huge deviation in pace in most teams. So most teams are averaging about 23, 24 seconds per play. And again, this shows itself in the numbers. If we look at, on average in non-overtime games, how many plays are in a game? On average, there's about 125 total plays per game. The standard deviation is only 7 plays. So a huge percentage of NFL games are falling between 118, or we can go down 115 and 135 plays. Like, there isn't that much difference. So if you have a team that's running a ton of plays and against a team that isn't running a lot of plays, that's actually the perfect scenario. People kind of might look at that and say, well, that slow team might hurt the other team. No, that slow team or that team that's only going to run 50, 55 plays, they're leaving 80 plays on the table for, like, the Falcons this week against Tampa Bay. The Falcons run like 55 plays per game. Tampa Bay might run 80 plays this week.
Right. They're almost helping in a way. I think, I was sitting here laughing as you're breaking down these awesome stats, saying what ends up happening, though, is that we end up just tying ourselves to the same offenses over and over because they're helping the game environments. It's bad for content creators. It's great for people who want to understand this game better, because we want to talk about new teams and new players. But you're exactly right. When teams leave the Buccaneers extra plays to run because of their slow pace of play, they're just inviting more opportunity for chunk plays, which of course the Buccaneers are capable of. The other thing we got to mention too is that you have to earn more plays in the NFL, right? You only get 4 downs to make another first down. So you have to have some level of efficiency to even get to the opportunity to be higher in plays per game. So again, it goes back to that first conclusion, which is we're tying ourselves to teams who are successful in doing that. Therefore, because that's going to correlate to more times they get to have plays run. It just means target good offenses, and that will lead us to game environments. I hate to make a simple conclusion out of something pretty complicated, but that's what we're aiming for.
No, I think that I think if we're gonna be digging into these things like pace and plays and really digging into these stats, the goal should be to come away with simple heuristics, simple conclusions. So I do think that's important. And again, just kind of finding the blind spots in the research. And again, the thing that I think the common person does when looking at pace or looking at plays is they want to find two teams that rank very highly. From an anecdotal standpoint, again, if most games are going to have about 120 to 130 plays, and you have two teams that run a ton of plays, one of those teams might win that battle, which means the other team might not have the opportunity. Again, we don't have a big sample on this just because there aren't many matchups where two teams rank super high in this, so we don't get a lot of empirical evidence on it, but we have some anecdotal evidence. We've seen it twice with the Cowboys this year, a couple weeks ago with the Chiefs, and earlier in the season with the Chargers, where if one team slows the game down or one team controls the ball, that shootout potential really goes away. And where I think this huge advantage, this huge blind spot could be, and we're going to have to keep testing this and maybe back test it as well, is that when we see teams that might not rank high in plays per game or in pace, if they're playing a team that is really low in that metric, the opponent could benefit. So for example, Minnesota is a team this week that is very middle of the road in pace and in plays per game, but they're playing a Detroit team that barely runs any plays. So the takeaway or the blind spot might be that teams like Minnesota in this situation could see that outlier week. They could be around that 75 play mark because Detroit doesn't run a lot of plays because they can't run a lot of plays because they're not good. So maybe targeting teams just against slow teams or against teams that don't run a lot of plays might be the overlooked thing. And hopefully we get a couple of weeks to use that to our advantage before the word gets out.
I love that conclusion. Yep. I mean, it can be oversimplified to play good players against bad teams, but yeah, I completely agree here. But we saw it last week with Minnesota where San Francisco pushed them, and they, regardless of pace of play, they're still able to be in huge shootout games with tons of fantasy scoring.
Yeah, I'm excited to. I've been digging into these numbers over the last couple of weeks. I'm excited to take some of these lessons into practice this week, specifically on a couple of those teams that we talked about. Tampa Bay and Minnesota, I think, really fit well against some really slow teams this week, or teams that don't run a lot of plays. Not the same thing, remember. So that's a good one. I like that a lot, and I appreciate everybody watching and listening to it. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the audio version on whatever podcast platform you listen to. If you're listening to podcasts, please check out our YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe on YouTube, the 4for4 Football channel. If you are on iTunes, please rate and review. It helps out a ton. And if you haven't signed up for 4for4 yet, a reminder that our new rest of season price is down to $24 for the DFS subscription. Go through Super Bowl. We got a couple Saturday slates coming up. We have playoffs. We have lots of playoff slates because there's extra games and only one team on a bye. So you're actually getting a bonus value over what you've got in the past season. So we're doing content for almost every slate. Still tons of time to use the tools and win some GPPs. And if you use the promo code DFS MVP, you'll get an additional 10% off. Please check out our other live shows as well. Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern time on YouTube is our cash game review. Every Saturday, the DFS Yahoo values with Matt Harmon on the DFS MVP and the Yahoo podcast feeds, and the GPP Last Look show every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern time with Jordan Vanek on the subscriber only Discord. Make sure you get signed up for that in the description below, and please follow us on Twitter if you want more of this fantastic content. 4for4 is at 4for4 Football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We will talk to you guys on Monday.